Hello there, welcome to Hoojies Garage. Today I'm standing outside the Saab museum. The museum has been here for quite some time now. It's been here since the middle of the 80s, I think, or 87 or something like that. It was moved from a little basement below a garage or a gas station that Saab had for historical cars in those days. But as Saab made some money in the middle of the 1980s, they decided to make a proper museum. Now, the building as such is not new for Saab or anything like that. It was a kind of deserted industrial building they built, or another company, Nohab, whatever they were called. I think it was Nohab. They made locomotions here, steam trains. So just about 100 years ago, they built over 1,000 locomotions in this building. But now Saab isn't in existence anymore, and then it's a bit extra interesting to take a look at the Saab history. So let's get inside and take a look. In the beginning, Saab made aircrafts, which this little propeller should symbolize. But times were uncertain in the world in the 1930s, and there was a decision by the Swedish government to make airplanes. So the company Saab was formed, Swedish Aeroplane Limited, and that went fairly well. But the war ended, which was a good thing, of course. Now the military aircrafts would not be built forever. Of course, there would always be some military production, but not to the extent that was made during the Second World War. And accordingly, Saab were looking for other business opportunities. One little thing was, here comes Peter. Yeah, just had to say hi to Peter that manages the museum. Anyhow, where were I? Anyhow, business opportunities. Well, small aluminium boats were explored. They made a couple of hundred or something, but that was not really the future, not enough money to make there. Although it was an interesting design, a little aluminium thing like that. Of course, they were very used to making things out of aluminium. But cars, that seemed to be the future. So a team of engineers up at the aircraft division in Linköping started to project a car. And this is one of the prototypes that were made. Quite an early prototype, and as you can see, aerodynamics was for sure an important thing if you come from the aeronautical business. Now the guys of course knew how to design things out of sheet metal, and they knew how to make let's say bodies of sheet metal. Okay, aluminium was the thing, but they quite quickly understood that aluminium will be too expensive to make a car from, which Audi didn't understand with the Audi A2 many decades later, but another topic. But of course they did not know how to make a car really, and absolutely not a powertrain. So in this specific car there is a DKW powertrain, and when they were to do their own tooling and their own design of a powertrain, it was the DKW engine that was the master in a way, and I would say that it's just about a copy of the DKW engine that's in the first Saab 92 that will pop up here just around the corner. So, you know, okay, they knew how to make a body, but everything else was really a big learning adventure, I would say. The aerodynamics of this car is of course super good for its era, and it's decent already even by today's standards. I hear or read values somewhere in between 0.30 and 0.35, so not too bad, right? Now of course, if you would take that car up to a speed that is maybe closer to 200 than 100 kilometers, then I think that thing would literally lift off the road or fly off the road. But since the car would never reach anything higher than just around 100 kilometers per hour, no problem. Here's a view of the front of the car. As you can see, the prototype differs quite a bit from the production model. and there's this little anonymous badge in the front just to not to reveal what kind of brand it will be. As you can probably see, the doors are extremely thick, and well, there were quite a few changes to be done after this prototype was built, but in the end they nailed it down to the 92 model. So here we have the production model. It's quite a bit different from the prototype. The roof has been moved up quite a bit to give proper headroom. The rear seat in that one was a bit, you know, so-so. Just about everything has been changed, of course. Wheel arches have been opened up for serviceability and also mud and snow not getting stuck in there. But it's not that far away from the prototype, and it's still a very aerodynamic car for sure. Now, just getting a proper volume production done, that was a real adventure. For instance, they had no experience in stamping parts in like this, and the shape has been well, they were a bit optimistic and couldn't run press simulations or anything like that. So here in this area they got wrinkles, lots of wrinkles, and they had a real headache just trying to get some kind of decent appearance, because they just had to kind of get the wrinkles beaten out and then just cover it in this liquid metal that you coat things with. Tin, I think it was. Oh, anyhow. And these were the days. Every piece of glass is flat. Windscreen is flat. This one is flat. Everything is flat. The body design as such is quite an achievement, and that was where they excelled in a way. They knew how to make monocoque structures, let's say like that, because of course the car has no frame. They considered it to be very important to get the suspension loads into the body in a proper way. Of course the fenders and the bonnet doesn't take any load, but everything in the structure was carefully calculated and built with kind of aeroplane standards in those days. The suspension ended up a bit weird with some arms moving like this, and they made it like that because they wanted to have the transverse engine installation just like the DKW had. Now there are of course a lot of things that were a bit so-so with this car, but for its time and for its purpose it worked. Now at the rear you can see that they thought body structure were more important than kind of almost anything else. So the car has no trunk lid. Every opening of the body they considered to be a bit of a, not really a problem, but a challenge. So they made sure that they had good reinforcements around everything. They liked the kind of triangularity of this because that made the structure stiffer and better. Now this was of course a bit impractical. You had to load the luggage from inside. Just a two-door, and you had to get all the way in there, fold the rear seat, and then put things in the trunk. And as one can see, there is also a bit of fuel at the rear of the car also. Anyhow, it's quite an interesting piece of engineering, this Saab 92, I must say. Then they understood that they had to improve some things. The lack of exterior trunk lid was not appreciated, so after a couple of years of production they introduced the 92B. This is a typical 92A, quite a rare car. So the 92B had a externally loadable trunk. But still, there were lots of things to improve, and they realized that they had to make an upgrade of the car after a couple of years. And since we're now in the decade of the 50s, we'll head on for the Saab 93. So here we have the Saab 93, an evolution of the Saab 92, of course, but with lots of changes underneath. For instance, the suspension, where this Saab 92 had the torsion bars. This one has what you call it, a screw spring instead, or screw springs, and it has proper A-arms, and the whole front suspension design is way better than the Saab 92. Now this concept of front suspension with the double A-arms and so on, that one, or this design, of course with some small modifications, but the suspension as a concept lived on all the way until 1993. So that's quite an achievement. Now, more power was needed. The Saab 92 had some 25 horsepower or something. They had to take that up a bit. There was no doubt about that. And DKW had gone into a 3-cylinder engine, and so did Saab. But Saab tried to do it, well, they had to design their own engine, of course. And that was a struggle. First of all, with the proper, let's say, proper suspension setup, a transverse engine was out of the question. There just wasn't or isn't room for that. So the engine had to be longitudinal, and the engine in front of and the gearbox behind it. Now, designing an engine while you have never really done any proper engine development. The Saab 92, that engine was kind of a copy of the DKW. Here they had so many issues. Sizing bearings, piston sizing, head gaskets leaking, just how to design a head gasket properly. No one knew. They had to learn it the hard way. And unfortunately they had to learn it while things were in volume production. Anyhow, in the end they made it, and the car ended up being fairly reliable, I would say. And as you can see, to prove the designs, Saab went into rallying, and already the Saab 92 was rallied a bit. That car has, of course, someone has made a number on it, and it has a few modifications for rallying, but not that many. This specific car, has been in Mille Miglia some years ago, and well, rallying improves things. Race on Sunday and sell on Monday, that goes for many car brands. Here you can see, for instance, the rear end of the car with the external trunk that the 92 also got. Here the 93 has a bit of a bigger rear screen also. Also the rear axle or rear suspension was updated. So yeah, quite a bit of a more modern car, but still room for lots of improvements. The car has, as far as I know, this car has heating also. The 92 didn't really have heating, at least not as a base car. So ventilation was improved and heating was introduced. And well, you could think, how could they not have heating on a car like the Saab 92? Cars in those days typically didn't have heating. You dressed up and then you went. Now, as the final iteration of the Saab 93, I'm trying to see if there's another Saab 93 here of that version. Anyhow, as a final iteration or development of the Saab 93, the door hinges were moved from the rear to the front. And of course the door handle went the other way. That was the Saab 93F model, F for front hinge door, I would think. That one was built just a short time, around 1960. So there were more things going on in the 1950s. For instance, the sports car, the Saab Sonett. Let's take a closer look on that one. So here we have the Saab Sonett, or the Saab 94. The numbering of the Saab cars is a little bit interesting. The civilian projects had the 90 series to use as numbers for their products. So the Saab 90 was an aircraft. I think it was the Saab Scandia, small regional air commuter plane, so to speak. I don't know how many passengers it could take, maybe 30, 40 something. and the Saab 91 was a way smaller airplane, just one engine small aircraft. I don't know how many passengers could it take, 2, 3, 4, something like that. Saab Zephyr, Saab 91 Zephyr. They were quite popular, and you can still see an aircraft like that flying around every now and then. So anyhow, so the third product in the civilian lineup, let's say like that, was the Saab 92. Then came the Saab 93, and here we have the Saab 94. Now this was intended to be a race car only, and it was a bit of a project initiated by I think he was a head of testing or something like that, Rolf Melde, quite famous person in Swedish automotive history. He got fundings for making this car, and the first car were made with a handful of car builders, or whatever you should call it, car guys, and it was done in a barn outside of Trollhättan. It was not made within the Saab plant, so to speak. But there they made a kind of a monocoque design in a way, and everything was just racing. It was just to get speed. I'm not sure if all of them were made of aluminium or not. I think so, but I'm not 100% sure. But a riveted design that they made, and then they just put on a plastic body shell. And okay, making aluminium designs, they knew that fairly well. Plastic was a new thing, but they managed. But again, it's for racing only. They've deliberately made it right-hand drive, because then typically you sit on the right side when you race around the track like that. Now the interior of this Saab 94 is quite a bit special also. It has the production model's instrumentation, but as you can see, everything is oriented for racing. And they even put the gear lever down on the sill on the right side. The normal cars had column shift, manual column shift, but this one has a little, well, not on the floor, but almost on the sill. The rev counter or tachometer or whatever you call it is also a bit special. It comes from the sports model. The Saab 93 was made as a 750cc Gran Turismo sportier model, and this one has that instrument. Let's take a closer look. Since it was so heavily tuned, you could not apply full throttle at any RPM, and it says here below 3000 RPM only use half throttle, or don't exceed half throttle. It says so in text here on the instrument. Well, that's two-stroke. The engine though is the same engine as the Saab 93. Now the 92 had this 2-cylinder, 760 something cubic centimeters, developing maybe 25 horsepower. The 93, they got the output up a bit, depends a bit on which model year, but let's say somewhere around 35 or something. This one has 57 or something like that, so it was heavily tuned. And as you can see, there is no room for an engine over there. So they just simply turned everything around. The engine sits behind the front axle. That wasn't all that easy. Well, it was easy to do, but to get everything to run, they had to turn or start the engine the other way around. It works on a 2-stroke. And as you can see, quite an interesting car. Now, also racing, the cooling system is a bit weird. When you get let's say like this, you can lose water and they just fill on more, because that's not really an issue. So yeah, quite a weird design, but quick. Then what happened then? As they do in racing, they changed the rules. Now before that, they made another 5 of these cars, but not in the barn outside Trollhättan. They made them in Linköping, as far as I can recall. So there were 6 cars made in the end. But before they could really use them, they got kind of obsolete. The rules had changed, and well, tough luck. Still a very interesting car, and I think that I've been, no, not this one, but I've been out riding with some of the old guys in one of these, because that one was used to drive people around on an event somewhere long time ago. Now, one of the cars, no, a few of the cars were sold to private persons when they were just obsolete. Why keep them? So apparently 2, I think, stays within the museum, but the other 4 just were sold. And at least 2 persons locally in Trollhättan bought cars, those 2 cars, 2 of the cars. One rebuilt it, so he put a completely different body on it. Then that car was crashed and was just being in a wreck for many years, but it's been restored to this kind of condition by a guy in Switzerland, I think. And then I think there's still one in private ownership around Trollhättan somewhere. I don't know how old that guy is. Anyhow, but there's also been a few replicas made, also locally in Trollhättan. So I think there are 2 replicas made that are drivable and used sometimes now and then on during the summer. So a bit interesting. Now, the 94 was just a parenthesis, and it was kind of named the Sonett, Saab Sonett, and that part of the sports cars history will continue when we get into the 60s. But this was in 1956. I think this first prototype car was built in 55, and then in 56 they built some more, roughly at least. Don't quote me on the timing. But Saab also realized that it would be good to make a car that is more practical and more for a larger family and so on. The cars were quite small. Next car then, after the Saab 94, is of course a Saab 95. Logical. No problems there in the naming. So the 95 was to be more of a family-oriented car and an estate, just as simple as that. So the rear end of the car was designed like this. Now, this is not the very first model year. I don't think they have one here, or at least not at display. This one happens to be from 1961, so it's almost the same as the first. Anyhow, the design was made like this with small fins, you know. The car was made in the 1950s, so this was the fashion. It's just that over in the US, the design and the fins of the cars changed just about every year. On the Saab 95, it stayed like that for all its lifetime. Small company, small resources, and so on. Now, the Saab 95 was in a way also a step heading in the direction of the Saab 96, but the Saab 96 came in the 1960s, so let's stay within the 1950s for a while. But this car got a bigger, more powerful engine, went up from 750 cc 3-cylinder to a 841 cc engine, and this took the output up to around 40 horsepower, and it also got a 4-speed gearbox. So there were quite a few improvements in terms of the powertrain of this car. It also got a bit of a development in the rear end in the first year. The first model year just had a flat roof, but they got quite a bit of, contamination on the rear window. So they made a little air slot, or made this like a spoiler, and you have some shape here that really moves or directs the airflow down like that. To the best of my knowledge, it worked reasonably well. I've never seen a Saab 95 with any kind of rear screen wiper, so good enough in those days for sure. It also, the car was also introduced with something that came on Teslas many years, and maybe some other cars also. But okay, it's a 2 seats in the front. You can get 3 persons in the rear seat if you're not too wide. But there's also a seat in the rear that you can fold up, and that gives space for another 2 persons. I have tried to sit in a rear seat like that on a Saab 95, and I just barely fits. I can sit there, but my knees are really that close to the inside of the trunk lid. So it's a bit of an experience to sit there, but well, again, family car. If you need to take some kids, not for a very long journey, then sure, it works. And so thought Tesla some years ago. One more thing to mention. In 1958, I think it was, they finally got glass bending techniques supplied at the large glass manufacturers in Europe. So I think that until 1957, all glasses were flat. Now in 58, and also on this Saab 95 that came in 59, or was at least presented in 59, they made a little bit of glass bending. And one can see that also the rear screen has a little bit of curvature to it, but all the other glasses are flat. And one little other interesting thing is that this front window, it pivots here. It doesn't just go down like that, it pivots here. So if you look carefully, you have a radii here, or a radius, that starts from there. So the side window moves down like that. Here we have quite something. It's a Saab 93, but heavily modified. As you can see, it has two engines, or a six-cylinder two-stroke engine, but of course two production engines that have been put together in this configuration, and with a rather weird gearing to get everything into the still single gearbox. The car is indeed very special. It is to compensate for the increased weight in the front, they have tried to make the car lighter in the front end. The fenders are plastic. The front bumper, whatever you should call it, is also a glass fiber thing. The appearance is a bit so-so, but still, this was just meant to be a test vehicle, and it was not really meant to beat any records in any way like that. The main idea was to make a vehicle with more power, but front-wheel driven. It was a test car to learn how front-wheel driven cars perform with lots of power. And lots of power, well, in those days it was lots of power, and Saab 93 had around 40 bhp. Okay, you could tune it to some 55, maybe 60 and so on, but in that range. This one, well, there's a little sign saying 140, yeah, maybe. I've seen other figures on 130, but it's in that range. And yes, it was quick, as long as it lasted. They had lots of, torsion and vibration and lots of weird things going on with this powertrain. And they were running tests up on a racetrack some 3 hours away from here. And in the end, the gear broke, and the car was, to my knowledge, restored to some degree during the 1990s, because I have seen this car running, and I have heard this car running, and it's absolutely fabulous. So I don't know if there's some recording of this car somewhere on the internet, but it's an amazing sound for sure. Talking about the speed of it, the sign here says 223 kilometers per hour. I would think that that's correct. I've seen some other figures saying 196, but doesn't matter. It wasn't really made for speeding. It was made for testing front-wheel drive and a lot of power. Really interesting car. And next to it is the other Saab Sonett of the museum. Now, this car the initiative was, again, as far as I can understand, again taken by Rolf Melde to make this car. But the head of engineering, Gunnar Ljungström, he was quite a character, I must say. He made some weird things. For instance, he took a car from the office and he had a meeting planned in Stockholm, so we drove there. No big deal. And when the meeting was over, he went to the central station and took the train home. Well, so someone else had to get up there and pick up the car. He just forgot about the car. He also had a little checklist for the designer, so that when a designer came with something, or an engineer came with a design that he had made, then he had a little funny checklist. And one thing was that in his own subjective thinking, if the design wasn't looking good enough, it was rejected. So it says the design should not be unnecessarily ugly. Okay? He was the manager. He also wrote some funny things for engineers to remember things better, that when you draw a beautiful lady or a cast part, it should never have any sharp edges. And in Swedish it even rhymes. So, a bit of a funny guy also. Well, they have a bit of a cleaning day in the museum, so things are not in the normal order. It's a bit noisy also, anyhow. I hope you can hear me. Here we have another set of 1950s Saab, an original Saab 92, also a very early car from 1950, and a very late Saab 93 with the front hinged doors. Now, when you see these cars here, you can think, well, were all Saab 92 cars green? Initially, yes, for sure. I know that there were at least 10 cars, Saab 92 cars, painted in black, because there were some rally or racing driver that didn't really want to compete in a green car. They just thought it was, or he just thought it was awful. But in general, yes, they were green. Then I think there came some kind of maroon, red after some years, but initially all cars were green, indeed. I mean, in those days, you were lucky to get some paint just after the war. Getting metal wasn't all that easy. It was a completely different time than compared to today, unless you start to think about Corona and semiconductor issues. At display here in the museum, they also have a whole row of powertrains or engines with gearboxes. Here we have the first, the Saab 92. Yeah, little two-cylinder, single carburetor, kind of a copy of a DKW, at least in terms of the engine. I don't know that much about the gearbox. As you can see, it sits in front of the front axle or the drive shafts. A very compact design in a way. But again, the Saab car was a narrow car, and extending this into 3 cylinders, they just had the opinion that it wouldn't work, and they had to redesign the suspension, so they had to turn things around. And then we come into the Saab 93 engine, which we have here. So when you see them like this, you might think that what's the difference in a way, but of course, to get the drive shafts in the same direction, this should be turned like that. Now, a bit bigger, a lot of struggle, a lot of development, a lot of trial and error, but in the end, they got it made. Still a 3-speed gearbox, but, well, redesigned. As you can see, they have this overhead fan shaft, which looks a bit odd, but that's the way they had to get more airflow through the radiator that was sitting kind of here over the gearbox. Now, with this, I would like to end the decade, or the first decade of producing cars in Trollhättan, 1950s. That was this chapter. So I'll be back in another chapter, talking more and showing you more from the museum about the 1960s. Take care.